Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our fifth edition of our fraud webinar series. We're in our second week. We thank all of you for joining us this afternoon. I'm Judy Howard here at ARC, Manager of Customer Experience, and excited to have all of you on the phone with us this afternoon. We have some guest speakers with us that I'll turn over to in just a little bit from Featurespace. But before I do that, I want to introduce my colleagues that are here with me this afternoon that have put all of this together. They're in our risk management area. I have Cornelius Hatting, who is the Director of Risk Management and Compliance here at ARC. He's been with us now for over a couple years, and his team looks at the impact of fraud across both the agency and airline channels. And they've done a great job since Cornelius has been here under his leadership of really taking a look at all of the processes and how they can detect frauds earlier. He comes with us with over 17 years of experience in operations and in risk management in the fraud area. He's worked pretty much all over the globe. He's worked in Europe, he's worked in Asia, Middle East, Africa, and the US, when we're really happy to have Cornelius here leading our team. Along with Cornelius, we have Doug Nass, who's our Director of Fraud Investigations, and Doug has been with us here at ARC for over 25 years. So he also has a wealth of experience, and for most of his tenure here, for the 23 years, he has been in the fraud area. So Doug is, again, a great asset to the ARC team here as well. Before we get started and before I do hand it over to our friends at Featurespace, I just want to let you know we'll be muted on this call this afternoon. And if you do want to ask questions, and we encourage that throughout the presentation, go to your control panel on the right-hand side where it says questions. Just type in your questions, and we'll get to those as we go through the presentation this afternoon. Like I said, we have these experts here, and we have the folks at Featurespace. We don't have them here all the time. It'd be a great opportunity to get in all your questions, and of course for Doug and Cornelius here at ARC as well. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Simon Rushforth, and we have Eric Labiak on the phone, and I'm going to have them tell a little bit about themselves. So Simon and Eric, I'm going to hand it over to you.
That's great, thanks Judy. So I'll just introduce myself very quickly. So Simon Rushforth at Featurespace. I'm a subject matter expert. Looking at fraud and payments. So I sit in the product team, so the link between our customers, their requirements, and then our platform, so how we can interpret needs into functionality. Prior to working here, I worked in mobile telcos, travel and leisure, so obviously there's a connection there. And then before that, worked for payment service provider, processor, and then did some work in the PCI space as well. So kind of similar to Cornelius, around 17 years in the payment space. Eric?
Yes, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, Simon as well. My name's Eric Labiak. I'm also with Featurespace. I've been with the company since the fall. I was brought on board to support the expansion into the US market. We had our launch in November, and that's about the time that I started. Prior to that, about 30 years of sales, marketing, management experience across the technology industry. I've spent a lot of time with new technologies like robotics, and the past 17 years in the payments industry, in the fintech side of it. With that, I'll take you through our first slide. Simon's going to be doing most of the speaking today, but there are a couple things that we at least want to let you know who this company Featurespace is. We're not IBM yet, but growing very rapidly. The company actually was born in Cambridge, England, in the UK, at the university. Cambridge has long been a hotbed for artificial intelligence and machine learning. Some of the press has been good, some of it lately not as good. But we're real proud of the fact we coined the term adaptive behavioral analytics. If you've been around any fraud technology shows lately, I think you'll see that just about everybody is talking about adaptive this or adaptive that, and we're real proud of the fact that that buzzword has taken off. Today, we're in over 180 countries, and we're extremely proud of the fact that we have 100% of our customers have been retained over the years, and we're 100% referenceable as well. That's not because we're nice guys, I don't think. I think the technology is just sensational. Tons of awards. I won't go through all that. I won't go through all the customers, but you know, we have really been focusing on very large organizations, large payment processors, large financial institutions, and currently we're going after the largest banks in America and the largest processors. So that's where most of our business lies today. Simon?
That's great, thanks, Eric. So I'll just give everyone a kind of overview of the webinar, what we're going to be covering, just to make sure you're in the right place. So what we'll cover, we're going to look at why OTAs are a particular target for fraudsters, the trends in the OTA space. Then we're going to look around how we can stop them while balancing fraud and good customer experience. And then finally, we're going to try and wrap up with what to look for in a supplier to do just all of that. So we'll take a quick look at some of the current fraud trends in the OTA space. Looking at some very high-level figures here, we've got 21 billion per annum, which we're seeing in the current figures in the travel intermediary space. Now, this is forecast to rise to 25 billion by 2020. It's kind of an interesting fact that, because I'm involved in some other industry bodies, and the theme, certainly what's being reported there anyway, is fraud seems to be decreasing, yet travel is still being forecast to rise. So I think that just kind of speaks to the point that fraudsters like online, and they like the travel product as something that they can monetize or just use for free if we can't spot them. So those kind of headline figures, we then go into what do we see as the ways that fraudsters obtain data. So at the start, they have to get the data, so it's not necessarily the end where we're looking to stop them, but you have to be mindful of that in order to get the full picture. So we've got security breaches. So this is things like man in the middle, man in the browser, other security weaknesses in any part of your organization. So things like malware, lack of robust authentication. You can think about things like firewall and other logical weaknesses, segmentation of network data, all those sorts of things. We then go into other ways of obtaining data like phishing. So this is, you know, your standard email attack or approach from a fraudster trying to obtain your details so they can go off and use them. Something that I know has been an issue in the OTA space is spoof websites, but also just any spoof website. So this can be in the bank or agency. And then we go into things like account takeover. And that doesn't just need to be your bank account. It can be social media, email, anything else that can result in people essentially accessing your details and then using those somewhere else. So if we then move on to what we're seeing in terms of some of the ways that these can be used, or the details that have now been taken can be used, we're going to see things like non-domestic cards being used. So in a previous role we had 9 out of 10 cards issued from, in this case it was Canada, but can be any country, were fraud. But that still doesn't mean that that's something that you want to put a blanket block on. Clearly you've got one card there out of your 10 that you want to accept. So rather than looking at things like just a blanket block or what have you, is how do you get to that good guy out of the 10? Other things are around bot attacks. So we can talk a bit more around those a little bit later and how to spot them. But it's a pretty common theme. It's obviously a way to use lots of data to just kind of brute force your way in. So we also have friendly fraud. Now I've put this in a grey box. The reason for that is it's not necessarily a fraudster. It's still a fraudster, but it's not necessarily someone who's obtained details spuriously. These are people that are committing first-party fraud and saying simply it wasn't me, and looking to pull a fast one. Largely it's online, which really speaks to the OTA space. You know, it's something that you don't have to turn up for necessarily in terms of to be able to commit it. You can set up your spoof website, you can do all these other things, collecting your data and go and buy your travel. Other things to look for: immediate departure, group bookings with multiple destinations. So we're going to look at things where they target peak holiday. They're going to target times where your fraud team are not in the office. So weekends, those sorts of things. They're going to look at group bookings and bury themselves down at the, you know, passenger 3 or 4, something like that, with multiple destinations, with the idea being to kind of mask their true departure or true destination airports. And the main thing about this, all of these things, is that it's really interesting to look at these based on your margin. So your fraud loss based on your margin, which is the true cost. So previously, I've worked in organizations where it's been interesting to have the conversations where they're not too worried about the fraud level because they turn over so much. But if you tie it back to profitability, profitability can be like 1% of turnover, or you know, obviously higher. But in some of the more kind of established long tail travel businesses where they're meeting all of the suppliers well, margins can be quite low. So actually the cost of fraud can get astronomical when you look at it back to sales. So we look at that, and then we look at things around the payment journey. So this is what the experience is like for a customer coming through the website, and the pressure that's put on this journey. So you've got pressure from marketing, pressure from sales, and this is to improve checkout speed, improve conversion, make sure that you're getting all of these commissions or other things tracked through the site, and offers and all these other things. So by way of removing data elements that you capture, so this can be things around authentication through email, and all this other authentication, setting up an account, verifying via social media, that sort of stuff, and removing authentication steps. Now, I'll touch a little bit on 3DS. I know that's not something that's super prevalent in the US, but depending on the mix of your customers and where you transact, then clearly in Europe it's something that's very relevant. The external pressures. So fraudsters looking to exploit all of the above in terms of the reduction in friction and move away from additional authentication steps. We looked at this on a separate webinar, looking at the dark web and all the fun that's had there in terms of fraudsters sharing knowledge on the dark web. They even write tutorials, and people can pay to essentially get trained. So you can move up through the ranks and pay more money to learn more, and people willing to share that information at a price. So looking at a example of a typical journey, this is someone comes in, we're asking them first name, last name, address, city, region, zip code, all these sorts of things. Then next step is we're looking for payment details, CVV, expiration, CVC, CID, whatever card you're accepting, confirmation around is your information correct? Do you want to change your delivery? And then moving on to the payment, where you can review and submit. So already a relatively lengthy process to go through. And that might not be the end of it. Depending on card type, we might then move into an additional step. This could be something else like email authentication, but an additional step for the customer to complete. And during that call out time, if we're talking about 3DS, where the customer's interacting with a third party potentially, they can drop there, and it's a really interesting kind of statistical metric to look at, which is the dropout at that stage, because effectively you've converted the customer, they've made all of the buying decisions, and then that additional step, and it's where they go out and come back in again in terms of understanding the effectiveness of that that step. And it's certainly something you need to do to balance between getting good customers through the door and also stopping the fraudsters. But 3DS is market dependent, so we did some study into this, which is looking at things around the acceptance rates, and essentially in the UK, if you attempt 3DS, generally speaking, the consumer will not be asked for their password, but you will still get liability shift. So if you see a UK issued card, then you're pretty fine to go ahead and attempt 3DS. Whereas if you saw a card from maybe somewhere else in Europe, like France, Spain, something like that, you might see that actually you get a higher decline rate by attempting 3DS. Then also you might get more customer dropout because they've got this additional step that they have to jump through. So, different user experience based on risk. You need to know your metrics so you can see the good from the bad to ensure your customer conversion rates stay at an acceptable level. And this needs to be broken out by card type, by geography, or even by payment type. Obviously, there's your other kind of payment methods that are out and about in the wild. And you want to protect your good customers from fraud. So this is more on the account takeover. If you've got account creation where people coming in and they've maybe accessed someone's email account and now they've come in, they've got some password weaknesses there. They're now accessing the online account they have with an OTA. And then they can go through, change the password, but they've rerouted the email or something along those lines. And then you can't just go down the route of saying, no, I'm not going to accept transactions that look slightly suspicious, or indeed blanket block a group of customers based on a bin. As customers want to browse and buy now, and depending on the sale value, they'll go elsewhere if the journey isn't as they'd expect. Obviously, people do end up with their favorite sites, etc. But ultimately, making it difficult for your customers is going to reduce satisfaction and hit the bottom line. So, one of the things that I've been shown in the past is a kind of ideal payment flow for a customer, which is they've already selected everything, but they just want to add their name, card, expiry, CVV or CVC, and check out. It's one of the things we had looked at in the past, and you don't necessarily need a CVC even to get an auth. So you could go, or name, so you could go card number and expiration, and then look for a checkout there or a payment there and auth, which is one way to go. Not necessarily something I'd recommend, but by using some additional information that you can capture, then you can potentially move closer to this sort of checkout experience by still remaining secure. So that's what we're going to start to look at now, is how to obtain a lower fraud rate while balancing that against the customer experience. So some of the interesting things in here are around, we already capture data which can be used without adding customer friction. So we're looking here at the art of friction without friction, which is my briefly reference for the day. So we're going to look at things like device ID. Now, device ID is normally going to be from a third party, so that's something that you're going to look to engage with, but that's data that we can take in and then start to use that to profile the device. Look at IP geolocation. Again, you probably want to look for a partner for that, just because it gives you a way better view on where the customer is. And then we're going into things like behavioral biometrics. So this is around JavaScript collectors, having those running on your website. so that you can then start to pull things in, which I'm going to discuss in a minute, around the behavior, around how the customer's interacting with the site. So these are things like details around the device. These are things like click speed, their usage of shift, left shift, right shift, which numbers they're using. Are they using the number row or the number pad? The key duration presses, all these sorts of things. Some of the information that our data science team also find exceptionally useful is the rich travel data that's available in the travel industry. So these are all the things that I referenced earlier on around the departure destination, around the time to booking, around any changes in the itinerary, all those sorts of things, which are really, really indicative of good and bad customer behavior. So we can collect data through the customer journey on an individual basis. So this can be then used per customer and used in a real-time manner. So what we can do is make decisions on those and say, okay, this looks like the same guy coming back. It's Bruce, and all of his click behavior, etc., and his device, maybe he's got a different IP, are the same. So we're going to say this is a good customer. There's no need to step up authentication or do anything else like that. So he can go through a nice, smooth checkout process. So I'm going to go a little bit into behavioral biometrics or insertion behavior. So this encompasses all data elements that can be captured as a customer browses and buys. So we can calculate things around the future transaction, looking at the behavior of them adding their data or inputting their data, should I say, on the payment page, which we've seen is the most relevant place to put it, balancing here the amount of data that you're capturing versus the fraud impact. And then we're looking to optimize decision making on individual transactions. So is it fraud or not? So we can put all of these in our adaptive behavioral models to look at the behavioral data being captured to make decisions in real time. So we look at this data coming in, which is all quite interesting, and I'm about to step through to the next slide, which shows you the data and how we can then visualize that. But it's kind of interesting to see the way that these can be displayed. And by looking at the data that we've collected from customers, we can see how far from normal activity it is. Now, looking at the data, we can see that most of it, and I'm saying 68% here, is within one standard deviation, either plus or minus, from normal, with 95% of the data being within 2 and 99.7 being within 3. So you can see outside of the 2 deviations, anything over that is just way far from norm. So if we look at these features, and we've broken these down into 4 different categories. So we've got system features. These are things that tell you about the device. Event time received, time offset, operating system, screen resolution, all these sorts of things to help with the device. This would work potentially in conjunction with your device ID, which again would provide some of this data as well. Mouse features, so average click duration, average double click latency, left click, right click. Things like right click can be quite interesting around whether someone's pasting items into the payment page. Keyboard features, there's an absolute ton of these. So average key press duration and latency, left shift, right shift, depending on handedness, then you would normally use one or the other. Again, the number pad, delete presses or backspace presses, these are things that people have a real preference for. It's kind of interesting if you like that sort of thing to talk to some of your friends or colleagues about their preferences, and you can see that people are normally locked into using certain keys, shortcuts, those sorts of things. And then miscellaneous features, which are average time between text fields, idle time percentage, those sorts of things, because they're super useful for identifying things like bot attacks, where essentially the bot has been optimized to get as much data in as quickly as possible. When you see someone typing normally, there's some overlap between a key press and the next key being pressed. It's just, you know, as we type, we normally are pressing more than one key at a time. And then you put that in with idle time and all these other things, and then you start to look at how quickly people are typing. You can actually almost see a cadence in especially people entering their passwords. So when you unlock your laptop or something like that, you can kind of almost hear the same pattern when you're typing your password every time you do it, which is again something that you can see in the in-session data. So now we kind of look at how that can be visualized, which is again taking back those standard deviations. And this I've taken in a risk event just to give you an idea. So when you hover over the information, it then gives you the absolute attribute that you're looking at. So if we're looking at the keyboard features, those two there that are swung way out to the left and way out to the right, or left shift, right shift. So you can see that they've moved away from using left shift and actually using right shift now. So it's taken this a long time to be able to get to the simple layout, which is something that fraud analysts can visualize in a UI to get really useful and rich information around a session. So it's a session fingerprint that basically gives you an idea of exactly what's going on in that session and whether it's something that is common to that person or whether it's something that deviates from the norm. So this is data that can be easily obtained, but is not something that's going to add friction to your customer journey. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to hand over to Eric, because I've probably spoken enough right now, and he's going to go into how we can stop fraudsters. Eric, I'll hand over to you, and if you just give me a shout when you want the next slide, I will gladly do so.
Sure.
And Simon and Eric, before you get started, I just wanted to, we did have a question that came in to us here. And the question is, how long can a merchant retain behavioral data that now that GDPR is in place? Can one of you answer that before, Eric, you continue on?
Oh, nice GDPR-based question to wake me up in the afternoon. So essentially, people do obviously have the right to be forgotten under GDPR. So if someone requests it, then we can remove the data. For this, though, this is for the prevention of fraud, which means that the GDPR rules are slightly flexed a little bit. I will probably have that as a larger takeaway, because I have done my GDPR training, which I have to do here, but I've forgotten the duration that it is allowed to be stored for. So I can, if you want to drop me that question through info@featurespace.com, I'll flick the details up at the end of this. Then I can gladly get you the definitive on that.
That sounds great, Simon, and we will definitely get that question over to you. Thank you. Eric,
super.
Sorry.
Thanks.
Yep, perfect. Eric, sorry to interrupt. I'll turn it back to you.
No problem at all. Thanks for the questions. We like those. Okay, Simon, let's move forward. All right. Well, machine learning, artificial intelligence, deep learning, big data. I think you all have heard these buzzwords quite a bit over the last few years. It seems like all the rage across industry today. The question is, how do you know where to apply these technologies? And I'd even pose a second question. What do you mean by machine learning? I mean, Simon talked about some behavioral adaptive analytics that we offer. That's very different than things that are also called machine learning that have been around for the last 30 or 40 years. And we'll touch on that a little bit in this presentation as well. Next slide. Okay. This is a picture of some of the areas where you can apply machine learning. Specifically, that second circle in with all the red dots are some of the areas where we've had great success. Oftentimes cutting fraud in half and reducing false positives by upwards of 75–80%. Phishing, merchant compromise alerts. It's not always a consumer or a fraudster. Sometimes it's the whole merchant that's gone bad that we're monitoring for. Account takeover. Application fraud is very hot today when people are applying for new cards, new accounts, new whatever it is. Fraudsters like to come in at the application phase today a lot, and that's something that machine learning is very good for. Bots and malware. We talked about transactional fraud, of course. That's I think primarily what we're talking about today. But one thing I will point out is that one of the great things that machine learning does, it picks up new fraud types that have not been invented yet. And that's really one of the big advantages of the technology in the marketplace, being able to identify things that no one has ever seen before because they're anomalies. The outer circle here, and the ARIC Fraud Hub is the name of our product, are all the examples of inputs that can go into the system. Device IDs, Simon mentioned earlier, behavioral data is really the heart of it, knowing how people are holding their cell phone, how fast they're pushing the buttons, how hard they're pushing the buttons, all those sorts of things. I know it's a little spooky, but that's how the system works. Transactional data, right out of your payment system, geolocation, magstripe, you name it, we're picking up all sorts of data. I think our record to date in implementation is 82 data streams going into one application, allowing us to make decisions on who's a fraudster and who's not. The center of the circle represents our platform, our ARIC platform, and describes the things that we do in there. That's where we actually detect the fraud, of course, where all these things feed into. But it also is a case management system. It's where we do our reporting. There's a network analysis tool, so we can look at fraud around the fraud that we've detected and see if we can figure out some sort of pattern there. And business rules, of course, and really important is a good sandbox. We're able to actually play around with new rules, new models, and figure out if the new models perform better than the old models by looking back, say, a month or 2 months in time, and looking at that data. We rerun all the data and see if how we've adjusted the system works better than how it worked before. Or we'll play it forward in the sandbox. We'll run both systems, the old rule set, old models, simultaneously with the new rule set, and that allows us to figure out which one's better and quickly promote the new setup to capture fraud. Simon, next slide. Okay, so this slide is about how it works. First off, I'll explain ARIC. It stands for Adaptive Real-Time Individual Change Identification. And those individuals, in your case, would often be an individual consumer, right? That could be something that we're profiling. And we're profiling them in two ways. We're profiling if they've been a repeat customer, their individual behavior, but we're also profiling them against their peers. So you're looking at a contextual profile along with the individual profile. The system also works for things like ATMs. I mentioned before, it could work for merchants. So we can profile merchants and see when merchants are behaving badly. One of the questions I get asked all the time about the system, because people are starting to learn buzzwords or are looking into machine learning and artificial intelligence, is it supervised or unsupervised learning? And there are two types, and I'm not going to get into all that today, but the important answer is it's both. We have both supervised and unsupervised learning, and the supervised learning means that your people who are working, the organizations that we're helping fight fraud with, are looking at cases that get spit out of our system where we're identifying potential fraud, and then they're managing those cases. They're applying labels to those cases. Yes, this one was fraudulent. No, this one wasn't fraudulent. This was a good chargeback. No, this was a bad chargeback. And sure enough, that allows our system to get smarter. Overall, the way the thing that really sets this new adaptive behavioral analytics technology apart from historical artificial intelligence and machine learning type models is we are profiling good behavior. We want to look at not just at writing rules and building models to screen out fraudsters. What we do is we study what your good consumers are doing. They're buying travel in a way that's, you know, that's within the rules. They're good people. They're not trying to defraud your company or the airlines. And because we study the good behavior, we're able to quickly identify when things fall out of that. We don't just, that's how we identify brand new types of fraud, right? Because we're patterning the good behavior. So you can see the feedback loop there with the labels coming back into the system and learning. It does also learn just by watching without labels as well. Simon, next slide. Okay, here's an example of an e-commerce merchant and a case study that we've done recently with one of our customers. And I think online travel agents and most travel agents have some sort of portal today. So you're all e-commerce merchants, or many of your e-commerce merchants of one type or another. So I think this applies really well. You can see they wanted to use our fraud models to understand, you know, all the behaviors, and really they want to cut back on fraud. They want to cut back on chargebacks. And you know, you can see on the right-hand side there some of the figures that we've been able to achieve as far as reductions. And as I mentioned before, they can be very dramatic compared to legacy technologies out there. Simon? This chart, and we're going to build it slowly, I think does a really, really great job of contrasting the older technologies to the new technologies. And one thing I want to make clear at this point, we're not saying the old technologies are bad. They're great. I mean, I studied them in college, you know, 30 years ago, in engineering school. And sure enough, a rules-based system is what I was studying then. And there are lots of rules-based systems in the marketplace today fighting fraud and doing a great job at it. Matter of fact, our engine includes a rules-based system. When we bring a large processor or a large FI over, or a big e-commerce merchant over to our system, they often have rule sets that they want to bring over. If we do our job well, they'll bring over far fewer rules than they ever had to use before, and over time, probably they'll get rid of even more rules. But you can see the problems with rules. Your detection rates are very good when your rules are fresh, but when the fraudsters come around and figure out new things, new types of fraud, those rules don't work anymore. So your effectiveness falls off over time. Then you write some new rules, your effectiveness pops back up. Then the fraudsters come up with new stuff, effectiveness drops down. You don't get the detection rates that you want. And of course, if you write the rules too strict, then you're turning away good business. You're creating false positives. So, you know, once again, rules-based systems have been around for 30, 40 years, an important part of any fraud strategy, but we've come a little bit farther than that. Why don't you advance it just one click here, Simon? So the next advancement, and you know, if you think of the amount of fraud that we're capturing being the area under the curve, were the traditional modeling system. These were the first, and I'm not going to say the first artificial intelligence, because even the rules-based system back in the day we called artificial intelligence, but these are the first of the newer generation of machine learning. Challenge with traditional modeling systems is, once again, you can see that there are points where the effectiveness starts to turn down. And you get, worse yet, you get an up and down. And any of you who are managing larger organizations, or even mid-sized small organizations, when fraud hits, it usually hits in waves, right? And these systems, you tend to, it's more difficult to manage because you know, for a while it works well, but then you've got to refresh the model. You got to give that system a new model to bring it back up to the effectiveness that it used to have. Go ahead, one more. Now you can see what adaptive behavioral analytics, our type of machine learning, the latest and greatest machine learning brings to the market. And the difference is, you can see when we get to that point of new fraud types there with that little X occurring, our system identifies it right away and learns from that. So we don't get that oscillation and up and down. we don't get 2,000 alerts today and suddenly 3,000 alerts tomorrow. The system gives you a nice flat line, and that's one of the other big advantages of the technology. People who are running operationally can set up their call center, their fraud analysts to handle a certain amount of fraud, and we can tune the system at that amount of fraud and allow them to operate their business effectively. Go ahead, Simon. Thanks. Okay, I'm going to pass it back to Simon.
Awesome. Thanks, Eric. So yeah, we're going to kind of just take a quick run through what we've covered and then look to go through and see what the sort of things to look for in a supplier are now. So the data elements you need to consider is obviously protecting customers from fraudsters who are sharing data. It is their job, and they devise new ways to attack your site, to use or steal card data and other payment data. Things like application fraud, but more recently things around synthetic IDs, which is a whole another topic which is super interesting if you're into that sort of thing, which I think probably most of us are. And with bots and other things like that, using stolen account details and customer data, you can open new bank accounts, brute force your way in that way. So you need to balance that against the customer experience. So as I said earlier about that 9 in 10 being fraud, you can't just stop that bin. It's just throwing away the one good guy that you want. And as Eric's covered off nicely, looking for good customer behavior rather than focusing on the bad is the way that we handle that. We then have the demand for an efficient and nice to use checkout process. So customers can come along, you spend a lot of money getting them to your site through marketing and other things. So once they're there, you want to maximize the throughput, but also you want to make sure that those customers that are going through are good customers, performing genuine transactions, rather than turning them away and ending up with poor customer satisfaction. There's a ton of choice out there, especially when we're talking in the online space. So making your customer journey as good as it can be is the way that you're going to make yourself your business successful. So we're going to say, don't panic. You're not alone. We've, I think, all been doing this for a number of years. So we here at Featurespace have been working on our platform and the things that we can do within it. But some of the points to take away is that it's not just about adding more customer friction. It's actually using that data. So by using Featurespace's fraud tool, we can take all that data and the data attributes in, and most importantly, actually do something with them. So it's looking at that data in real time. And the things that we discussed earlier is things around login. If that's something that you have, account level data, Insertion, and that really rich travel data, which is really useful. We've done work in the travel industry where we found that data to be exceptionally useful. And then again, in some of the processes that we work with, where they have travel as a vertical within their book of business, and it's something that we absolutely use and kind of treat distinctly. So you have obviously your different verticals within any processor, and the travel space with that additional travel data, all of the route, destination, departure, hotel data, etc., is all things that are very, very useful in us making decisions. And again, making those dynamically so that you can make a decision real time: is this a good customer or not? And importantly, behind all of this, which is something that I'm pretty keen on and have been in previous roles, is understanding the metrics and when to add these additional steps. If you can decision on all these things in real time, because ultimately by allowing these good customers through is going to stop fraud and protect the bottom line of your business, which is why we're all here, to try and just do that. So I'd like to thank everyone for attending the webinar. It's not quite over yet, so we're going to turn it over for questions, but I'd just like to say thanks for attending. I hope you found it useful, and we'll open the floor up for questions.
Great, thanks Simon and Eric. And if there's anyone on the call that has questions to ask, please again go to your control panel on the right-hand side and ask those questions. Eric, do you have any that have come in on your end?
Yes, got a couple here so far, and I'll direct these to Simon. Simon, what is your current footprint in the travel industry today?
Sure.
Who are you doing business with?
So one of the people that we're doing business with that we're really proud about is IATA. I would think that a lot of people on the line will know about them. We've spoken at the travel symposium with them last year about what we were doing with them. That in the travel space, and then as I say, we're working with some of the largest processors globally, and we're going to be doing that on the travel book of business for them. So yeah.
Fantastic. The next one here is, what types of fraud attacks does your adaptive machine learning system fight best?
Yeah, okay. Well, I think you were kind of getting to this earlier as well, in terms of it's the fraud attacks that potentially we haven't seen yet, but also it works just as well on those that we have. Essentially, what we're looking at is anything that is looking like it deviates from normal, but the normal of the individual. So because you're looking at that, you're not having to put in these rules where if it's greater than $10, or if it's more than X time of day, or what have you. Because Eric, the normal that you're probably used to in your checkout experience is completely different to mine, but we're still both good customers. So I guess the answer is we're good at spotting all of them. And the more data we have, the more effective our models get.
Okay, thank you. We've got another one here. It says, what is the best way to identify if it's the merchant or agent that is fraudulent, or the card holder themselves?
Okay, so with that, it would probably come down to the looking at things like patterns in BIN and patterns in IP and those other things. So in terms of if it's a fraudulent agent, and I guess we're talking about, I'm going to have to make an assumption around it being a card being used to make the payment, rather than like an agent bust out in some way. So if it's a card being used, you might see something around a particular type of BIN. You would potentially see a similar IP being used, those sorts of things. Whereas if you see that it's like a card holder who's on the fraud side of things, then they might cycle through the cards, the BINs a bit more, those sorts of things.
Okay, thank you.
Okay,
Judy, go ahead, Judy. Any more on your end?
Yeah, thanks, Eric. Got ahead of you there. As OTAs build more robust fraud detection systems, what other areas will fraudsters start to target? Maybe call centers? Like, are there other areas maybe that you can think of or talk about?
Yeah, absolutely. And we've had approach from travel companies which are seeing fraud pushed into call center. So it wasn't my analogy, but someone kind of explained fraud to me as being like a balloon. If you squeeze it in one place, it doesn't go away; it just gets bigger somewhere else. Yeah, absolutely. The call center. You know, I think we're seeing more things around kind of like money mules, where these are people looking to move money through people, and they'll find, you know, students, those sorts of things, people who are studying, where they'll get them to use their accounts to then transfer funds through, obviously saying they'll give them a little cut or what have you. So those sorts of things. But I think, you know, in a perfect world, it's going to go away. But ultimately, I think fraudsters really love travel. They really seem to like it. I think it's something about them that I don't know why. I can guess why, but it always seems like an area that is under constant focus from fraud attack. You know, it's obviously, you know, the kind of monetization of it, etc. But yeah, we have had absolutely contact from several other organisations and travel organisations saying they have problems outside of online. Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Simon. Again, good analogy. It just seems like if we kind of can tackle it in one area, it just shifts to someplace else. Yeah, and fraud doesn't seem to be going anywhere anytime fast. Eric, any more questions on your end?
No, I think we're clear, Judy. Thank you so much.
Okay, great. And I'm just going to do a little housekeeping here before we have still a few minutes if anyone on the phone still wants to type in any questions for Simon and Eric, or either here, Cornelius or Doug on our end here at ARC. But I just do want to give you guys the fraud information on our side. If you do suspect fraud, you're not sure if it's fraud, we do have a couple ways that you can reach us here at ARC. We have up on the screen right now, we have our fraud hotline where you can call directly at 855-358-0393. That again will come directly here and our group will be able to guide you. Or you can also email us at stopfraud@arccorp.com. That stop fraud which is on the screen at arccorp.com. Again, don't hesitate to utilize either of these ways to contact us, because we'd rather have it not be fraudulent and you be concerned than actually have it fraud and you didn't want to bother us. So these numbers, this information is here for all of you to help you kind of navigate through this very complex industry where these people are just spending all of their time trying to be devious. So again, contact us. Eric, Simon, any last words before we kind of end this call today?
No, I just would like to say thank you, the guys at ARC, for organising all this and doing a great job promoting it and running it so seamlessly, and everyone for attending. Really appreciate it.
Yes, thank you so much, everyone.
Great, and again, everyone on the phone, we thank you for, if this is more than one of the fraud, of our series of fraud webinars that you'll be attending this month, we thank you for your valuable time. I just want to say we do have one coming up tomorrow, and that will be hosted and presented by our very own risk manager at our corporate level, and he's going to be reviewing PCI for travel agents protecting valuable customer data. That should prove to be a very interesting session as well. We have a chock full week next week starting Wednesday. We have a session next Wednesday, what travel agents need to know about debit memos. That goes into the evolution of credit card acceptance, and then we end it with what you have cyber criminals that cyber criminals want. That one should be very interesting. They all should be actually, but that's kind of a neat one as well. So as always, feel free to reach out. I'm jhoward@arccorp.com if you want to email me after this session. We will be sending out the presentation. The recorded session will be posted on our website starting in October. All of these sessions will be. And as always, thanks again. Hope you can join us for some more of these sessions that we have this month. And thank you again, Simon, Eric, Cornelius, Doug, and again, everyone on the phone. Have a great rest of, if it's evening, afternoon, or morning. Thanks. Bye now.